Welcome everyone, welcome back. Actually, my research or the background picture of this presentation, what does it imply? So bad news up front, it does not imply that we are going to jump into the close by Wannsee in a few minutes, which would be quite a good idea probably with this weather, but actually the idea is to dive deeper into the topic of diversity, of the so-called deep level diversity, and to see what actually happens underneath the surface of diversity, what happens when members of entrepreneurial teams differ in their personality, in their attitudes, in what they have, what kind of values they have and stuff like that. So I will explain that in a second, but first of all, so let's shift a little bit the focus of what we're talking about in terms of diversity. So in the previous talks, we have talked a lot about like how diverse is the society of people who become entrepreneurs in general. So how many women do become entrepreneurs, for example. What I would like to focus on now is to zoom in into entrepreneurial teams. So people who have already founded a new venture, who are part of entrepreneurial teams. So why is that important? Why is it important to focus on entrepreneurial teams in particular? So if you go outside on the streets and ask people like how do they imagine entrepreneurship, you will hear a lot that people think of entrepreneurs as solo entrepreneurs. So there's a very dominant stereotype of entrepreneurs being like lonely wolves. So people who just set out their business for themselves. This is actually, however, not really backed up by reality. So if you look at who actually founds new ventures, you will quickly find that it is, in the majority of cases, it is teams. So more than one person, they get together and they come up with a business idea. This also has a series of advantages. So entrepreneurial teams are much better because they bring together a broader range of qualifications. They are more efficient, and they also can, of course, achieve multiple complex tasks at the same time. The finding that businesses are often founded within teams has sparked a lot of research, and I'm part of a research group, and I'm interested in the research perspective. Research has dealt a lot with the question what actually makes teams, entrepreneurial teams, successful, or how should a team actually look like? How should an ideal, successful entrepreneurial team be composed? So how should the members of the entrepreneurial team, what kind of characteristics should they have? And in particular, the question of should members of entrepreneurial teams be very similar to each other? So like in that picture, these guys all look and appear very similar to each other. Or should members of entrepreneurial teams be actually quite different from each other? Should they possess different characteristics that make them unique and if they join together? So two maybe little disappointing news up front regarding that question, whether diverse teams are actually better than more homogeneous teams. The first news is that actually diversity is not always beneficial. So we've heard already this morning about the business case for diversity, and many, especially practitioners, tend to stress the good and little bit romantic view that diversity is always something good that a team can benefit from. However, research has shown that often diversity is a double-edged sword. So it can have positive impacts on, for example, team performance, on innovation, on all different beneficial outcomes, but it can also, in many cases, have negative outcomes. So the second disappointing news is, from our research perspective, we are still not we don't have total knowledge about how it works and what makes diversity successful. So the answer that research often gives when it talks about complex questions is it depends. And in that case, it also depends a lot on the type of diversity we're talking about, and how diversity is managed, so the circumstances in the environment, stuff like that. So to conclude, diversity has many different faces, and diversity is a buzzword that you hear all the time, of course, during this conference, but also in the media. You hear a lot about diversity, so I would just like to quickly share what my understanding, or also many researchers' understanding of diversity is, which means that diversity is basically any difference between myself and another person that I can perceive and that I perceive as the person being somehow different from myself. So you can imagine diversity can have many different facets. It can start with the look that a certain person has and go deeper into how a certain person behaves, feels, and yeah, things like that. So depending on that view, you can look at different levels of diversity. So this is where the picture of the water again comes in. So first of all, we can divide diversity into the so-called surface level diversity. So that is actually what happens above the surface. That means any diversity characteristic or personal characteristic of another person that I can immediately observe, or that I can quickly observe. So I immediately see if another person has the same gender as I have, or if another person is younger or older than I. And I also often directly or quickly see where that person comes from. So this is something all that is quite easily observable as compared to the so-called deep level diversity dimensions, which means characteristics of another person that I sometimes only perceive or observe after I have spent some time with that person. So you all might know the effect that you, for example, get a new co-worker in your team, and you start getting to know each other, and after a few weeks you realize, okay, that person maybe has a very similar working style than I have, or has a very different personality than I have. So this is what we call deep level diversity. So differences between people that relate to stuff like personality, attitudes, working style, stuff like that. I would like to share a little bit of our research that we did on this deep level diversity. And in particular, that research dealt with diversity in entrepreneurial orientation. So again, if you think of a team of entrepreneurs who work together, we suggested that these members of that team can well distinguish themselves from each other in terms of the three different facets of entrepreneurial orientation. So they can actually be quite different in their proactiveness, in their risk-taking, and in their innovativeness. What does that mean actually, and why do we think it's important? So first of all, we think that differences in these three dimensions within teams have a certain important impact on team performance and team effectiveness, so how well people within the team can work together. So just imagine risk-taking propensity. So people differ in how much they like to take risks. So you have that guy on the right who is very risk-taking. So that person is willing to take risks, also to obtain future profit, feels well with situations of insecurity, and yeah, just goes for the risk whenever that is possible. On the left side, you have another person who is more risk averse. So that person tries to take the safer option and doesn't really like taking risks. So now try to imagine what happens if these two people join one entrepreneurial team and have to work together. We suggested that this would probably not be such a good idea, because in the process of founding a new venture and managing a new venture, you have to take a lot of decisions. Many of them include risk, high risk, And these two guys would probably have a totally different idea of what would be actually the right decision to take. So we suggested that if these people work together, there should be some room for conflict, room for disagreement. So we suggested that diversity and risk-taking propensity should actually harm team performance and team effectiveness. Second dimension that we looked at was proactiveness diversity. So proactiveness is defined as people's tendency to go forward, to be active, to take the initiative. So again, the guy on the right or the girl on the right is the person who is high in proactiveness, whereas the person on the left is low in proactiveness. That means that person is rather passive, does not really take the initiative, is rather somebody who waits for things to happen. Again, what would happen if these persons were joined into the same team and would have to take decisions together, lead a new venture together? So again, our idea was this would probably also not be as good, because if you have to take decisions together and you have one person who is really forward-going, who is trying to tackle decisions, who wants to do stuff, and the other person who is rather passive, waiting for things to happen, this should lead to, again, disagreement and poorer decision-making. Finally, we have the innovativeness dimension of entrepreneurial orientation. Again, there are two types of people. On the one hand, we have people high in innovativeness. We also call them innovators. These are people who actually try to do things differently. They all the time they question the status quo. They try to destroy existing solutions in order to create new solutions. They are very innovative, creative, working on stuff all the time. On the other hand, we have people low in innovativeness. These are the people who we also call adapters. So their approach is actually not to do things differently, but to do things better. So their approach is not to, that we don't have to necessarily destroy what's there, but to take what's there and make it better. So if you compare these two positions to each other, you will see that actually both have a viable point. So we suggested that these people could actually benefit from each other because they have both a very good idea on how to solve problems, and they should actually benefit from each other. So we conducted a research study with members of entrepreneurial teams, mostly in the ICT sector, and these are the results. So we found that actually, as we thought, proactiveness diversity was negatively related to team performance. That means if members of teams are very much different in terms of proactiveness, this actually harms team performance. So the same holds for risk-taking diversity. Also, it appears that being too different in terms of risk-taking does not benefit teams. Instead, it increases conflict within the team members and diminishes team performance. The only aspect of diversity that we found to be positive for team performance was innovativeness diversity, which increased team performance, actually. So what's the conclusion of these findings, or in general, of this idea of deep level diversity? So first of all, of course, surface level diversity is super important. We have to keep it in mind. But I would like to ask you not to forget about deep level diversity. So this is actually something that we have to keep in mind when we compose teams, when we think of how teams can function and work together effectively. So deep level diversity matters. Also, if you think about founding a new venture, finding team members who might join your team, think closely about how to compose your team. So think about what kind of characteristics of your fellow team members you would like to have in the team. And if you like to take into account the findings of our study, you can also see that it might be a good idea to choose another person who has a different approach in terms of innovativeness. So maybe if you're an adapter, you might look rather for an innovator. That would be good to team performance. On the other hand, I would recommend to avoid being too different in proactiveness and in risk-taking. So if you want to increase team performance, rather look for fellow team members who are more similar to yourself. Thank you very much for your attention, and try to remember that diversity can be a double-edged sword, so try to use it wisely. Thank you.